Hello and welcome to today's tutorial. My name is Tom Chaplin from Master the Light Photography Workshops and Tours, and today we're going to be talking about preparing our files for print in Photoshop CC. So hello and welcome to this tutorial. So the first thing we're going to do when we are preparing an image for print is decide on our paper type, where we're going to be printing, and installing our ICC profiles. Now, it's really important to do these things because they're all part of the decision-making process in printing, and all of these will make big changes to the way that your final print looks. So I'll talk through those one by one. So the first step, I guess, is choosing your print lab. So it could be someone that you've been recommended. Do some Googling for your local area, find out where people recommend as professional print labs. So for me in London, I've got a few choices. I would recommend Metro Imaging. I'd recommend the Print Space. Loxley Colour is fantastic. They're based in Glasgow. I've used Whitewall from Germany. They're also good. But any of these companies that present themselves as professional labs will look after you in the print process, and you'll also, you'll be generating more professional and higher quality prints than you would from your bog standard sort of Snappy Snaps or Photobox website. So if you're printing for one of those websites, then this is the tutorial for you. The next thing that you need to consider is calibrating your screen. So in this case, I've got I think it's called an X-Rite Color Monkey color calibrator, screen calibrator. I'll link that in the description, but basically all that does is it will adjust the brightness and the colors of your screen to more accurately match printing conditions. And this is really important because everything we do after this, after the calibration, is sort of reliant on the calibration, because we'll be making specific changes that you want to be able to trust. So if you just have your monitor out of the box and you haven't ever calibrated it, it's really important to get your hands on one of these, borrow one from a friend, or buy one. They're not overly expensive, and they're quite a good investment, especially even the cheap sort of £30 to £40 ones will do the job. You don't need to buy anything really fancy. And then your other decision is the paper that you're going to print on. Now, there are two print processes. I won't go into them now, but there is C-type and there's giclée. Giclée is basically French for inkjet. So they're just two types of printing, and they'll produce relatively different results. So for the sake of this video, I'm going to be assuming that I'll be printing a C-type image, which is the closest to darkroom printing that you'd get in the digital age. And I'm going to be printing onto a matte paper. So it's important to know what paper you're going to be printing on, because you're going to need to install what we call ICC profiles onto your computer. So now I've got that talking out of the way, I'll quickly show you what I mean by an ICC profile. So at the moment, in the bottom left down here in Photoshop, you can see that we've got the Adobe RGB color space. And if you don't see that, you can just click this arrow here and click Document Profile, and it will tell you which profile your document is currently in. Now, I'd recommend that when you're working on pictures, and you can, in most modern cameras now, you can adjust the color space that your image is taken in, always work in Adobe RGB rather than sRGB, because it just gives you more colors to play with, and it just gives more colors for you to edit with in post-production. There's no reason to not use it. It's not going to make your images any bigger. So you don't need to worry about filling up cards because of it. It literally just gives you more color in your pictures. There isn't a downside to doing it. And the other thing is this 8bpc down here is just telling you that it's an 8-bit image. Now, you can adjust your images into 16-bit, and you'll probably see this when you export in Lightroom. There's the option to change your file between an 8-bit and a 16-bit image. Now, basically, a 16-bit image, again, contains more color and more information. It makes a far larger file than an 8-bit file does. But there are almost no printers sort of around the world that will accept a 16-bit file. If you send them a 16-bit file, they will downsize it to an 8-bit file, and then they'll put that through their printer. So there's no reason to be working from a 16-bit image. And the few printers that can accept a 16-bit image, there have been so many studies and tests done that say the human eye can't tell the difference between an 8-bit and a 16-bit image. So I wouldn't worry about it, and just go for the smaller file size with an 8-bit image. Okay, so now we've got that out of the way, we can go into preparing our file for print. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to apply an ICC profile to our image. And an ICC profile is basically just adjusting the color space of your image so that it matches the printing conditions more closely. So to do that, we're just going to go to View, Proof Setup, Custom. And then in here, under Device to Simulate, we can select which ICC profile we'd like to use. So in this case, I'm going to be using the Print Space C-Type Fuji Matte. Now that's a Fuji matte paper using the C-Type process. Now I'm not going to go into the processes now, but basically there is C-Type and Giclée, Giclée being French for inkjet. Basically they're just two ways that you can print your images. If you're using a printer at home, there's a very, very high chance that you're using a Giclée or inkjet process. So you'd use an inkjet paper type for it. Now, if you don't have them installed, it's very simple to do. Just go onto the print lab that you're going to be using. They'll offer you ICC profiles as a download off of their website. Save them onto your computer, and then just go and click Load here. And in here, just find where you've saved them. So they might be in your Downloads folder, or if you're more organized, you put them in, put them somewhere else so you know you can find them. All you do is you find them, you select them and click load, and it will just load them in so that when you go to this Device to Simulate drop down, you'll be able to find it in here. So I'm just going to go and select Fuji Matte. I'm going to leave black point compensation ticked, and I'm going to leave simulate paper color and simulate black ink unticked. It's important to do that just because it will give you a more accurate rendering of what your print's going to look like. And the only thing you're going to have to decide upon in here really is your rendering intent. So you will probably never use absolute colorimetric. You're really just choosing between these three. Saturation is used in sort of fringe cases. It can be very good for landscape images because it focuses on the color tone of your image, but sort of leaves contrast and sharpness as less important factors when it's doing its render. Whereas perceptual, I'll show you in a second, but perceptual is like a flattening of your image, so it gives you more detail in your shadows, but reduces the contrast of your image. And then relative colorimetric is usually the closest to your original edit, and it will usually be the more contrasty option of the three. So if we leave it on relative colorimetric and we leave preview ticked, I'm just going to zoom in with Control plus or Command plus on a Mac. Just so I can see what it's really doing, and I can turn preview on and off just to see what it's doing to my image. And really all I can see it's doing is that my blacks are being slightly lifted when it's rendering, giving me a simulation of the paper type. They're being lifted up from absolute black to something just brighter than absolute black, and that's purely because of the print process. A C-type process cannot render black at all, properly. It can't do absolute black, and that's just because it's LED lights exposing onto emulsion on the paper rather than laying ink on the paper. So the process can't actually produce absolute black. So that's something to consider when you're choosing your paper type. And the other thing is that I can see the yellow in the buds. You might not be able to see it on YouTube very well, but the yellow in the buds on the tops of these cactuses is being ever so slightly changed, and that is because they're being changed because this paper stock cannot replicate the exact tone of yellow that I have in my original edit. So it's just something to know, because this is really why you're doing it, is just seeing how it affects your color. Now reds are a good example of a more problematic color, especially deeply saturated reds. Papers often struggle to render them, and you'll have more luck with reds on an inkjet paper than you will with the C-type process. It's just something you can play around with, and by applying this as we call it, a soft proof to your image, by showing you the paper type, you'll know whether that paper can render the color that you've edited. So it's just really important to know, because if you send off an image thinking, wow, this edit looks fantastic, I'm really pleased with that, and then you get your print back and the colors look completely different from your edit, that's going to be either because your screen wasn't calibrated closely enough to the paper, or your paper choice cannot replicate your edit. And so it's really important to know before you send off and pay for your print that your colors you're happy with your colors, basically. So for this image, rendering intent, relative colorimetric, device to simulate, print space, C-type Fuji matte, these unticked and black point ticked. I'm going to hit OK, and now it's just simulating that paper for us. So if we want to make any changes, we're now working under conditions that we know are going to try to replicate the paper stock that we've chosen. So this is where we do our color edit, and this is where we'll add sharpening to our file as well. So I guess the first thing I'll mention is that I'm not going to do any permanent changes to this picture because I'm actually happy with the way the colors have turned out, but another image you may want to make changes. So I'll very quickly show you how you would adjust the hues and saturations of your colors. The easiest way of doing it, the most straightforward way, would be to come down here to your adjustment layers tab. Then we're going to click on hue saturation. And then we're going to go where it says master, we're just going to click that and then choose the color that you want to adjust. So for me, it might be my greens. I'll go to hue, and this is where we can adjust it so that we're happy with the colors again, because the paper stock may have changed our colors to something we don't like. So we can just adjust it here. So for example, if I wanted my greens to be more orangey or more reddy, I drag to the left. If I want my greens to be more emeraldy and bluey, I drag to the right. So obviously a high change is going to look horrible, but if I wanted it to be more green, I could adjust my hue so they'd be more green. But for me in this image, I'm just going to leave it as is. I'm happy with the way it looks, and I'm happy with the way it's going to be presented on the paper. However, the thing I will do is I will add sharpening, because you need to add sharpening more so for print than you do for the web or for on your computer to show people, because your screen, with it being backlit, is naturally a more contrasty environment than a print which just has reflected light on it. So therefore, for it to be perceived as sharper, you need to have a slightly more sharpened image. So this is just a really good way of sharpening your images ready for print, and I'll just quickly show you that now. So all we're going to do is we're going to click, it's a bit of a long shortcut, but Control-Alt-Shift-E. When we do that, it's going to make us a new layer, or on a Mac, it is Command-Alt-Shift-E. And that's called a clone stamp layer, and it's basically making a copy of everything below, so that when we add sharpening, it's something that we can remove or adjust rather than affecting our actual original image. If that doesn't work because you've just got one layer, just press Control-J or Command-J, and it will just make a copy of your layer, which you can also work off of, which will be absolutely fine. So we've got layer 1 selected. We're just going to go here to Filter, Other, High Pass. Here, our radius, we're going to set to somewhere between 10 and 30, depending on the image that you're sharpening, how many megapixels your camera has. So as a general rule, the more megapixels your camera has, the more you can raise this radius, because it will have more pixels to sharpen. And the other thing to consider is if you've already added sharpening to your picture. So this was taken on a Sony A7R Mark III, which has 44 megapixel sensor. So I know that I can push my sharpening higher than if I was shooting on, for example, I used to own a Canon 5D Mark III that was a 24 megapixel sensor. So relatively, I can use more sharpening on my Sony files than I could on my Canon files. But for this image, I've already added sharpening in Lightroom, so I'm just going to use a radius of 15, so on the lower end of that sort of 10 to 30, or bang in the middle of the 10 to 30 range. So I'm just going to hit OK. It all looks really janky at the moment, so we're going to go over here to our blend mode where it says normal. We're going to go to soft light, and you can see that's now been applied over the top of our image. So if I zoom in and I turn this on and off, you can see how much sharpening it's adding. That's really effective sharpening, but it's slightly overdone it for me. So I'm just going to drag on our opacity slider, drag it back to about 70, just to take the edge off of the effect and, give it the sharpening I want it to be given. Because you don't want to over sharpen it, but you need it to be nice and sharp for printing. So I'm going to zoom out so I can see what I've done there. And now it's important here actually to make another layer. So as we just did before, we made a layer of our background to work off of. We now need to make another layer in case we'd like to add a border. If you don't want to add a border, I would still add another layer because it's good to work off of layers. So if you make mistakes, you can always, delete layers and work backwards. So it's good to be non-destructive in your editing. So we're going to do another clone stamp layer. So that's Control-Alt-Shift-E again. It's going to make a new layer called layer 2, and it's an exact copy of everything below. So this is now essentially the background layer with the sharpening, and it's all in one layer. So now I'm going to quickly show you how to make a border for your image. So the thing you're going to need to know for this step is how big you're printing your image. So for me, I'm going to be printing 20 by 16. So that's maintaining the 8 by 10 aspect ratio that I cropped this image to. So whatever your aspect ratio is, you need to make a decision on how big and how you want to print your image. So for me, it's going to be 20 by 16. You can print A sizes. You can decide for yourself. So I'm going to go up here to image, and then image size. And then here is where I can set the size of my picture. So it's really important that you set this to the size that you want it to be printed at, because most Pro Labs that you send your files to will print to the size of the document that you give them. So even if you say, I want a 20 by 16 image, and I give them a 22.1 by 17.68 inch image as it is at the moment, then they will print it at the size that the file is given in. So this is actually a really important step, that they don't print bigger and you get charged more money and it's not the size you intended to have. So it's really important in this step. So if you don't want a border, very quickly, you'll just set your size to the size you want your paper to be. So with no border, it's just going to be 20 by 16. Very simple. Resolution needs to be between 240 and 300. Anything lower than that and you're going to lose resolution, and your file is going to obviously be degraded when you print it. So just stick to 240 as a minimum, 300 is your ideal point. Any higher than 300 is fine, but the print lab will downscale it to 300 anyway, because printers won't accept, they won't feed images at higher than 300 through their printers, because you won't be able to tell the difference by doing that. And our resampling, automatic is fine, but I would be using Preserve Details 2.0. If you don't have it in your Photoshop, it's because in preferences you need to turn on software which hasn't been released generally yet. However, they're going to release it into their mainstream Photoshop sort of in the next couple of months. It's just because it's being tested under prototype conditions at the moment. But you can either turn it on yourself if it isn't out yet, but if it is out, it will be in Photoshop very soon. So when you're watching this, it may well be already there. But you either use automatic or Preserve Details 2.0. It'll be absolutely fine. It's just a slightly smarter way of resampling, resizing your picture. So, so this is what we'd use if we weren't having a border. If we do want a border, what I'm going to do is set my width to 18. It's because I'd like to have an inch border around my picture. So I know I need to take 2 inches off because I need an inch on each side. Very simple. I'm just going to hit OK. It's going to make my image slightly smaller because my file was originally bigger than the paper I'm printing to. Then I'm going to go to Image, Canvas Size, and then here I'm just going to set my width to 20, so I'm adding my 2 inches on, 1 inch on each side, and my height to 16.4, so that's a 2 inch increase, 16.4. I'm going to leave this as it is. I'm going to set my canvas extension color to white because I think white is the classiest border. You can use black, you can use grey, you can set it to a color if you'd like to, it's really up to you. But I'm going to use white because it's I think it's the smartest. And it will really add to the contrast of this image, which will be nice. So I'm going to hit OK. And there we go. It's added a border for me. And if I just want to double check that it's printing to the right size, I can go back up to image size, and I can see now that my width is 20 and my height is 16.4. So all I would need to do here is either I can print at 16.4, or as I wanted to, I can just untick this, set my width to 20, height to 16, hit OK, and it's just going to make a slight crop to my image. If you don't want to resize it like that, I'll quickly show you. So I'm just going to undo my canvas. I'm going to quickly set these back again. So my width to 18. Oh, sorry, turn that on so it stays the same. 18 by 16.4, hit OK. Just going to resize it. I'm going to go to canvas size, and then I'm going to set my width to 20, and my height to 16, because then it will match my paper size, which just means my border on either side is going to be my border on the top and bottom is going to be ever so slightly smaller than my border on the left and right. And I'm going to hit OK. And then if I go to image size, I can see it's 20 by 16. So that's how you'd add a border. If you don't want a border, you just don't do the canvas size steps. That's very easy. Okay, that's all good. And then the last thing I'm going to do before saving, totally optional step, but if you have a logo or a signature that you'd like to add, as I've got one here, just the Tom Chaplin Photography logo, I'm just going to copy it into my document. All this is saying is it's changing my source from sRGB to the current workspace, which is Adobe RGB. Even though we've got the simulation over the top, we haven't confirmed it yet. We just hit OK. That's absolutely fine because it's just white for me anyway. And I'm just going to resize it down and place it in the corner of my image. Something like that. Just a nice classy way to finish it off, especially if you're selling your picture. It can be quite nice to have it signed. You don't want it too big, so it's overpowering, but yeah, it's just a nice sort of classy way of signing off your picture, really. Now, the last two things we need to do is go to Edit, Convert to Profile, and then under here, just double check that our settings we set at the beginning are the same. So that's print space, C-type Fuji matte, and relative colorimetric, and then these are all fine. And then if you leave flatten image to preserve appearance on, which is definitely worth doing, it will just squish all your layers back down to one layer, which is important. So we hit OK, and it's flattened it down, so we've just got one layer. Now this is really important as the last step you do, because you need to be saving your file as one layer, because if you don't do that, you may be sending just a single layer off to print rather than your final image, which, you know, would be silly after we've just done all this work. So just make sure you flattened it down. If you don't have that ticked and you forget to, just select all your layers on the side, so you can click the bottom one, hold shift and click the top one, right click, and then just click flatten image, and it'll squish them all together and it'll do exactly the same thing. So we've got this, we've got a nice border. We've resized our image to the correct paper size. We've used an ICC profile so that the rendering on our screen matches the paper stock that we've chosen. And we've added a little logo in the bottom corner, and we've adjusted our color and added some sharpening. So these are all the layers that go into it, the steps that go into preparing your file. And then the last stage is then just saving. So we're just going to go to File, Save As, and then decide where you're going to save it. So I'm just saving it in a printing tutorial file. We're going to call it Tom Chaplin Cactus Fuji Matte, because that makes sense to the paper stock we're using. We're going to save it as a JPEG. We're going to make sure that the ICC profile, it matches. So this is ticked. This needs to be ticked. We're going to click Save. And then we're going to go to Quality, up to the maximum. There's no reason not to go to the maximum, because your JPEG is never going to be big enough that it's a problem for the printers. So just set it to the maximum, and then you don't have to worry about any resolution loss. And format options, you need to use baseline standards, just so it's using the least amount of compression on your file as possible. We'll hit OK, and there we go. We've got a saved image that's ready to be printed at a professional lab. Thank you for listening. If you have any other topics that you'd like me to talk about, or if you have any questions about the printing process, please do email me, message me through my site, or leave a comment below, and I'm sure I'll answer it. And yeah, thank you for watching, and I'll talk to you next time. Thank you for watching. I hope you learned something, and I'll see you next time.